Jon "Bones" Jones, the former UFC light heavyweight champion, has just announced that he's the one who will become this year's champion as well. Becoming the youngest person to hold a UFC title a little over a decade ago, not many fighters have risen up the way Jones has. And while the legendary fighter has had problems with the law outside of the octagon, you can't argue that he's had many issues in the cage. Starting off with Jon Jones, the 2023 UFC champion. Jon Jones' fights are known to always be exciting and thrilling. This legendary pro MMA fighter from the States is one entertaining man, but sadly for UFC fans, Bones hasn't competed in anything related to mixed martial arts in the last 3 years. His last fight was against Michael Reyes, against whom he successfully defended his light heavyweight UFC title. Jones took a long break from the UFC after he beat Reyes, but his ongoing dispute with the UFC and his possible shift up to the heavyweight class caused his break to span a longer period than he'd originally thought. No real updates have been made on his move to heavyweight yet, but if you think Rumor Mill is a reliable source, then we should get an answer sometime soon. All the speculation and rumors around Jones are partly his own doing when he tweeted out a pretty short and simple message, #Champion2023. Becoming a UFC champion in 2 different weight classes is a feat exclusively reserved for the absolute top fighters, and fortunately for Jones, he's already arguably one of, if not the greatest UFC fighter of all time. But even still, it won't be that easy for him to achieve this monstrous goal. The question isn't whether he's talented enough or not. He clearly is. We just don't really know what Jon Jones can bring to the heavyweight table yet. That's something we'll have to wait for. It's obvious that the former 2-time UFC champion is confident that he'll win, and why wouldn't he be? He's Jon "Bones" Jones. Let's see what Joe Rogan has to say about Jones. Coming up next is why Joe Rogan thinks Jon Jones is the best. The comedian, podcast host, and UFC commentator had a talk with Will Harris, a well-known videographer, where the two spoke about the starting days for Jones' UFC career and how after beating Mauricio Shogun Rua at UFC 128, he was crowned youngest UFC champion ever. Both the founder of Anatomy of a Fighter and the UFC commentator shared similar views on Jones being the greatest MMA fighter to have ever stepped foot in the octagon. Joe Rogan spoke about how Jones, being the youngest UFC fighter, started the match off with a flying knee against Shogun right off the bat, and just how crazy he was for that. The podcast host called Jones a wild man and the kind of dude who ends up going on to become the greatest of all time. Rogan also added how it's impossible to reach that level if you're just some normal person. Although Jon Jones isn't a madman in just the cage, but outside of it too. The UFC double champion has been rumored to use cocaine in large amounts, and the MMA legend has been at the center of many incidents with the law too. His entire career could have been done for after a hit-and-run conviction against him back in 2015. Jones has also amassed many charges around him for driving under the influence. Setting aside all the trouble he's caused outside the octagon, he's always had the ability to put on a display inside the cage. For a lot of people, and this includes experts like Joe Rogan, it's no secret that Jon Jones is the UFC's greatest fighter of all time. Up next, Michael Bisping wants Jon Jones back in the octagon. People want to see Jon Jones fight again after a 3-year-long break, and one such person is Michael Bisping. The former UFC champion and now combat analyst uploaded a video to his YouTube channel where he answered questions from fans. He shared his thoughts on Jon Jones in this video as well. Michael Bisping only had positive things to say about the former UFC double champion, as he labeled the American MMA star one of the greatest of all time. Bisping also went into detail about how he's been eagerly waiting for Jon Jones to return to the cage. The former UFC champion turned analyst spoke about how Jones is the kind of person who needs to fight, considering how he's the biggest talent that the UFC has ever seen in its history, and also especially since his break from MMA has spanned the past 3 years now. Jon Jones' game plan has been to move up to the heavyweight class and right off the bat get a fight for the UFC heavyweight title, though unfortunately for him, things didn't pan out the way he expected them to, with Cyril Gane getting his chance at some UFC gold instead. Next up is Hit and Run. The former 2-time light heavyweight UFC champion is thought of by most as the top mixed martial arts fighter of all time. Jones is obviously known for his techniques and talent inside the octagon, but Jon Jones has gotten a lot of attention for his behavior outside the cage too. About a decade ago, Jon Jones was wanted by the Albuquerque Police Department for questioning related to a hit and run on a recent Sunday morning at the time. A pregnant woman was involved in this incident and had to be taken to the hospital. The very next day, in a conversation with a spokesperson from The Guardian, the Albuquerque Police Department spoke about how they just wanted to ask questions from Jones, but the American UFC fighter didn't make any contact with them for some unknown reason, as he left the Albuquerque officers confused about what what's really happening. They even tried to get in touch with his lawyer but failed. The police then had to resort to witness reports and were told that Jones had run away from the scene, returned after a bit to receive a considerable amount of money, and then fled the site again. The police later discovered a pipe along with marijuana after inspecting the car a little. They even found Jones' name on the rental paperwork for the car. As one of the stars of the UFC, Bones was determined to defend his title against Anthony Jackson at UFC 187 as the Albuquerque Police Department tried to gather more info on what had happened. Let's talk about the consequences Jon Jones saw after his hit and run. Following up, Bones stripped of his light heavyweight title after the hit and run incident that involved a pregnant woman, and along with the Albuquerque Police Department diving deeper into the matter, Jones was arrested in New Mexico and his light heavyweight was taken from him. In a tweet later, Jones apologized to all the people he let down, and the double champion spoke about how he's got a lot of soul-searching to do. Lorenzo Fertitta, UC CEO, and Dana White, UFC president, met up with Jones in Albuquerque before they finalized the decision to deprive him of his UFC light heavyweight title. It also ended up depriving the UFC of one of their brightest stars ever, a fighter who's been regarded by many as one of the best mixed martial artists in history, even 8 years later to this day. UFC president Dana White, in an interview with Fox Sports, mentioned how Jones felt like he'd let himself down, and also how Bones wanted to be known as the best ever, though Dana also added that this was the correct decision and it was one they made anyway. Jon Jones had also won his battle with Daniel Cormier in January, even after he tested positive for cocaine in his reports. The UFC legend couldn't get his set fight with Anthony Johnson, the #1 UFC contender. The #3 contender, Daniel Cormier, filled in Jon Jones' shoes for a chance at the title instead. President White talked about how stripping Jones of his title wasn't fun for him. Also, he added how pumped Daniel Cormier was for his fight. Let's talk about Anthony Johnson versus Daniel Cormier. Following up, Anthony Johnson versus Daniel Cormier. UFC 187 was the first time since 2011 that a light heavyweight champion emerged in the shape of Daniel Cormier, winning in the second round via submission. Leading up to the event, there was a lot of hype, but sadly for Johnson, the bout ended when the #3 contender submitted him in under 4 minutes. Neither of the two UFC fighters is known as a technical striker, though Rumble Johnson's timing could have posed an issue for Cormier, who instead took the game to the ground. Cormier went in for tackles and even took Johnson down on several occasions, so regardless of Johnson having the advantage in punching power and striking, Daniel's wrestling techniques and grappling were a little too intense for Anthony Johnson to cope with. Though still, Johnson scares even Jon Jones, who the fans now want to see take on Ngannou. Finally, Jones versus Ngannou. It doesn't get any bigger than this, according to Chael Sonnen, former UFC star. In a YouTube video, Sonnen claimed this to be the biggest fight ever in the UFC, though he did add that it'd be a pretty unusual fight to happen, considering how both fighters haven't been too active for a while. We talked about how Jon Jones last fought Michael Reyes over 3 years ago to defend his title. Similarly, Ngannou's last fight was also a title defense against Cyril Gane a year ago, and ever since then he's been occupied with disputes over his contract with the UFC and has had surgery done for his unending knee problems. Though the possibility of a fight between these two UFC beasts has been made more likely by UFC president Dana White, who in a recent talk with ESP confirmed that the contract disputes between the Cameroonian mixed martial arts fighter and the UFC should be ending soon, and that this is where Ngannou belongs. White also wants Ngannou to complete his UFC legacy. Other than that, MMA Junkie reports Jones to return at UFC 185, potentially in the cage with Ngannou standing opposite him. That's a wrap for this video. Who do you think would win the fight between Jones and Ngannou? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.